I only turned one valve, and somehow an entire neighborhood decided I was the criminal. The steel handle felt cool beneath my palm as the first light of dawn spilled across my ranch, painting the water tower in soft gold, while the familiar diesel scent from the old pump house drifted through the crisp Texas air. The electric motor wound down with a slow mechanical hum before settling into complete silence, a silence so heavy I could almost hear the wind moving through the live oak branches. I checked my watch. 6:12 a.m. exactly on schedule. Maintenance day. 20 years of running this ranch had taught me one thing above everything else. Machinery never cared about convenience. It only respected timing. I locked the pump house door, slipped the brass key into my pocket, and started walking back toward the barn, gravel crunching beneath my boots with the comforting rhythm I'd known since I was old enough to carry a wrench. Then my phone buzzed. Once, twice, 6 times in less than 30 seconds. By the time I reached my truck, it was vibrating nonstop across the dashboard. Unknown numbers, county offices, local residents. Someone left a voicemail screaming that every faucet on Willow Creek Boulevard had stopped working. Another caller demanded to know when the city planned to restore service. The strangest part was that I didn't own the city water system. I never had. Yet less than 12 minutes after shutting down my own ranch pump, an entire upscale subdivision nearly a mile away had somehow run completely dry. Before I could even process that impossible connection, the distant sound of sirens rolled across the pasture. One patrol car became 2. Then a county utility truck appeared behind them, kicking up a cloud of pale dust along the ranch road. The lead deputy stepped out with the cautious expression of a man who'd been handed a story that made no sense. Behind him stood Rebecca Whitmore, perfectly dressed before sunrise in spotless white tennis shoes and a cream-colored polo embroidered with the Willow Creek Estates HOA logo. Her expensive perfume somehow reached me even through the warm country breeze, mixing awkwardly with the smell of cut hay and motor oil. She pointed directly at the pump house like she'd already solved the case. "That's him," she shouted before anyone asked a single question. "He shut off our water on purpose. Arrest him." I didn't answer right away. I simply looked past her toward the quiet pump house, sitting exactly where my grandfather built it more than 40 years earlier. The same weathered building everyone in this county had driven past 1,000 times without giving it a second thought. Rebecca folded her arms with the confidence of someone convinced the law automatically belonged to whoever spoke the loudest. What she didn't know was that I hadn't touched a single public water line. I had only shut down equipment standing entirely on my own land, connected to pipes my family had maintained for generations. And if turning off my private water for one day had emptied every kitchen sink in her neighborhood, then someone was about to discover a secret buried beneath this ranch long before her HOA ever poured its first sidewalk. My name is Ethan Calloway, and everything standing behind that weathered pump house existed because my grandfather refused to believe that dry Texas land had the final word. Long before Willow Creek Estates covered the hills with identical rooftops and decorative stone entrances, this place was nothing more than mesquite, limestone, and stubborn ranch families trying to survive another summer. My grandfather spent 3 years drilling wells that failed before striking the deep Trinity Aquifer almost 400 feet below the surface. My father expanded the system with a steel storage tank, a filtration building, and nearly 2 miles of underground pipe that crossed our own property before continuing downhill through legal easements signed decades before I was born. I grew up following him with a toolbox that was always too heavy for my hands, learning the sound of healthy bearings, the smell of fresh grease, and the difference between a pressure gauge that whispered trouble and one that promised another decade of reliable service. Most kids learn baseball statistics. I learned water pressure, flow rates, and how to rebuild a pump before breakfast. After earning a degree in civil engineering, I could have taken a comfortable office job in Dallas, but every time I visited home, I found myself standing beside that old pump house listening to the steady rhythm of machinery that had quietly kept this valley alive for generations. So I came back. I modernized the electrical controls, replaced aging valves, and installed monitoring equipment that sent performance reports directly to my phone. Everything was inspected, documented, and permitted through the county. Nothing about the system was hidden. What remained unknown was how deeply the surrounding neighborhoods depended on infrastructure they had stopped noticing years earlier. When Willow Creek Estates was developed, the builders chose the cheapest path possible. Instead of constructing an independent water supply during the first phase, they negotiated temporary access through existing easements connected to my family's distribution line. Temporary somehow became permanent. Ownership records became filing cabinet dust. New homeowners assumed every faucet in their kitchen was supplied by the city because that was the story they were told. Even many county employees had forgotten the original arrangement after decades of administrative changes. My family never complained because the agreements were honored, maintenance costs were shared fairly, and neighbors respected property lines. That changed the year Rebecca Whitmore became president of the Homeowners Association. She treated every map like a suggestion and every boundary as something that existed only until she disagreed with it. To her, the ranch was simply undeveloped space waiting to serve the neighborhood. The pump house was no longer private infrastructure. It was, in her words, a community asset that happened to sit behind my fence. Every time she said those words, I could almost hear my grandfather laughing somewhere beyond the windmill. He used to tell me that the easiest way to recognize someone who had never built anything with their own hands was how quickly they claimed ownership over another person's work. At the time, I thought it was just another lesson from an old rancher. I did not realize those words were quietly preparing me for the morning when one simple maintenance shutdown would expose a truth that had been buried beneath this valley for nearly half a century. Rebecca Whitmore never marched onto my ranch the first week she became Homeowners Association president. She arrived like someone conducting a property inspection she had already decided to fail. I still remember the soft crunch of gravel beneath the tires of her white Lexus sport utility vehicle as it rolled through my open gate one warm Thursday afternoon. The smell of fresh cedar from the fence I had just repaired mixed with the scent of expensive perfume drifting from her direction long before she reached the porch. She smiled politely, but it was the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. She looked past me instead of at me, studying the pump house, the storage tank, and the steel pipeline disappearing beneath the pasture. Beautiful property, she said. It would be even more valuable if it served the community the way it should. At first I assumed she meant cooperation between neighbors. I offered her a glass of iced tea and explained that every easement crossing the ranch was fully documented with the county. She barely listened. Her attention remained fixed on the pump house, almost like she had already imagined placing an official Homeowners Association sign on its front door. Over the following months, her visits became more frequent. Sometimes she arrived with 2 board members carrying clipboards. Other times, she brought contractors who wandered a little too close to equipment they had no business examining. They measured fence lines, photographed valves, and asked questions about pump capacity that had nothing to do with neighborhood landscaping. Rebecca insisted she was simply planning for future growth. She described my ranch as the logical location for expanded community infrastructure, speaking as though private ownership was an inconvenience waiting to be corrected. The first certified letter arrived a week later. It informed me that the Homeowners Association wished to establish routine inspections of all water facilities supporting neighborhood residents. I read it twice before laughing out loud inside the kitchen. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the room while the paper rested on the table beside decades of maintenance logs proving exactly who owned every bolt inside that pump house. I responded politely through my attorney, explaining that no homeowners association possessed authority over privately owned agricultural infrastructure. Rebecca answered by scheduling a board meeting anyway. Soon neighbors began repeating strange rumors. Someone claimed the ranch water system belonged to the subdivision. Another insisted the previous owner had donated everything years ago. One family even believed their monthly association dues covered operation of my equipment. None of it was true, but repeating a lie often enough has a way of making honest people question facts they never bothered to verify. Then came the survey flags. Bright orange markers appeared one morning near the entrance road and along the utility corridor crossing my pasture. I pulled one from the ground and noticed the fresh dirt still clinging to its metal stake. When I called the surveying company, the manager apologized immediately. They had been hired by Willow Creek Estates to evaluate future community improvements. No one had bothered asking permission before stepping onto my land. Standing there beneath the wide Texas sky with the windmill turning slowly overhead, I realized Rebecca was no longer testing boundaries. She was quietly redrawing them in her own mind, hoping everyone else would eventually accept the new map without ever questioning who had built the first one. The next move came so quietly that most people in Willow Creek Estates never realized it was happening. Rebecca stopped asking for cooperation and started acting as though permission had already been granted. One Monday morning, I drove into town for replacement filters and returned just after lunch to find a brand new green sign leaning against the outside wall of my pump house. It had the Homeowners Association logo printed across the top in bright white letters above the words Community Water Operations. I stood there for several seconds listening to the steady chirping of mockingbirds while the afternoon breeze rattled the loose corner of the sign against the concrete wall. Someone had carried it nearly half a mile across private ranch land and placed it there without saying a word. I loaded it into the bed of my truck and drove it straight back to the Homeowners Association office. Rebecca greeted me with complete confidence, almost amused that I had taken the time to return it. She smiled and said it had probably been delivered early by mistake because the board expected to install permanent signage after approving a new infrastructure management plan. I reminded her calmly that there would never be such a plan because the pump house belonged to my family, not the subdivision. She responded by sliding a folder across the table. Inside was a proposal requiring quarterly inspections, unrestricted access for Homeowners Association representatives, and authority to schedule maintenance around neighborhood needs instead of ranch operations. Reading those pages felt surreal because every paragraph treated private property as though it were already community property. I declined the proposal without raising my voice and left the office believing common sense would eventually prevail. Instead, the pressure increased. A week later, I noticed fresh tire tracks leading to the pump house after sunset, even though I had not scheduled any contractors. My security cameras confirmed that 2 individuals wearing reflective safety vests had walked around the building with flashlights, photographing valves, electrical panels, and pressure gauges before quietly leaving. They never damaged anything, but they clearly assumed they had every right to be there. When my attorney sent another formal notice demanding that all unauthorized visits stop immediately, Rebecca replied that the Homeowners Association had an obligation to understand critical infrastructure serving its residents. That single sentence spread through the neighborhood faster than any official announcement. Soon homeowners began stopping me at the grocery store asking when the board would finish upgrading the ranch water facilities. Others thanked me for maintaining what they believed was neighborhood equipment funded by their monthly dues. Every conversation revealed the same misunderstanding. Rebecca had repeated her version of the story so often that it had become accepted as fact by people who had never seen a single deed, easement, or engineering record. Then another certified envelope arrived. This one informed me that the Homeowners Association intended to begin collecting a new infrastructure oversight assessment to support future improvements associated with the water distribution system. I read that letter twice while sitting on my porch as the evening sun reflected off the steel water tower that my father had welded together with his own hands decades earlier. They were preparing to collect money for equipment they did not own, standing on land they did not control, connected to a system they barely understood. That was the moment I realized Rebecca was no longer relying on confidence alone. She was counting on everyone else forgetting where the water had truly begun. I expected the situation to calm down once lawyers became involved, because facts usually have a way of slowing down people who move faster than the truth. Instead, everything accelerated. Within 2 weeks, I received notices from the Homeowners Association claiming that my refusal to cooperate placed neighborhood services at risk. The wording sounded official enough that several homeowners assumed a government agency had written it. Even the county switchboard started receiving calls from confused residents asking why the ranch owner was refusing to maintain what they believed was public infrastructure. I spent more time answering misunderstandings than repairing pumps. Every explanation felt like pouring water into sand because another rumor appeared before the previous one disappeared. Rebecca attended every board meeting with color-printed diagrams that looked impressive from a distance. She pointed at maps filled with bright lines and arrows, telling homeowners that modern communities required centralized oversight and that private ownership should never interfere with essential services. The audience nodded because the presentation sounded reasonable. Very few people asked where those maps had come from or whether they matched the records filed at the county courthouse decades earlier. I quietly requested copies through public records procedures. Some pages looked familiar. Others contained newly added labels that described my family's facilities as shared infrastructure even though no deed or easement had ever been changed. Whether those labels came from misunderstanding or assumption, they created the appearance of authority, and appearances often spread faster than documentation. My attorney advised patience. He reminded me that paper filed in the wrong place did not magically transfer ownership. Still, patience became increasingly difficult every time another stranger drove slowly past my gate, staring at the pump house as though it belonged to the neighborhood instead of the ranch. Then something happened that bothered me more than every letter and every rumor combined. A utility contractor called to confirm an inspection appointment that I had never scheduled. According to his work order, he had been hired to evaluate future upgrades for community water facilities located on my property. He sounded genuinely surprised when I explained that no permission had been granted. He apologized immediately and canceled the visit, but before ending the call he mentioned that several companies had received similar requests over the previous month. Rebecca was not merely talking about taking control someday. She was planning as though control already existed. That evening I walked the entire pipeline route across the ranch while the setting sun cast long shadows over the pasture. The familiar smell of dry grass and warm earth surrounded me as meadowlarks called from the fence posts. Every valve cover, every marker stake, and every section of buried pipe reminded me of weekends spent working beside my father. Nothing out there had appeared by accident. Every foot of that system represented years of labor, engineering, permits, inspections, and careful maintenance. Yet people who had never tightened a single bolt were beginning to speak about it as if it had always belonged to someone else. As I reached the old pump house again, my eyes settled on a weathered metal cabinet tucked against the back wall beneath layers of dust. I had not opened it in years because most of its contents had been replaced by digital records. For reasons I could not completely explain, I brushed away the dust and rested my hand on the handle. Something told me the answers everyone was arguing about had been sitting quietly inside that cabinet all along, waiting for the day someone finally needed to remember how this valley had truly been built. The cabinet door groaned as I pulled it open, releasing the dry scent of old paper, machine oil, and cedar that had been trapped inside for decades. Dust floated through the narrow beam of morning sunlight cutting across the concrete floor, while rows of carefully labeled binders stared back at me exactly where my father had left them. He believed that every important project deserved two kinds of protection: solid steel above ground and solid documentation inside a file cabinet. I began lifting out thick engineering folders, their edges worn smooth from years of careful handling. Beneath maintenance logs and inspection reports sat a long cardboard tube tied with faded blue twine. I untied the knot slowly and rolled a set of oversized blueprints across the workbench. The paper had yellowed with age, but every survey line remained sharp. Across the bottom corner appeared the original county approval stamp dated 1978, followed by the signatures of licensed engineers, surveyors, and county commissioners. My eyes followed the heavy blue line, representing the main transmission pipe leaving our pump house before crossing the ranch through recorded easements. It continued downhill exactly as I remembered, but one detail immediately caught my attention. The subdivision that would later become Willow Creek Estates had not existed when those drawings were approved. Instead, a handwritten amendment attached years later authorized temporary service connections during early residential development until an independent municipal supply could be completed. Temporary. The word was underlined twice. Behind that amendment rested another folder, containing correspondence between my grandfather and the original developer. Each letter repeated the same condition. The ranch would continue supplying water only until the neighborhood constructed its own permanent infrastructure or negotiated a new long-term agreement. I kept reading. That replacement agreement never appeared because it had never been signed. Instead, decade after decade, ownership changed. Board members came and went, and everyone quietly assumed the temporary arrangement had somehow become permanent simply because time had passed. It had not. The legal easements still belonged to the ranch. The pumping equipment still belonged to the ranch. The storage facilities still belonged to the ranch. Even the maintenance responsibilities described in every inspection report listed my family by name. I felt neither excitement nor anger. I felt clarity. For months, Rebecca had been building an argument based on confidence while the truth had been waiting inside a dusty cabinet less than 30 feet from the pump itself. I photographed every page using my phone before placing each document into protective sleeves. Then I called my attorney and asked him to meet me at the ranch instead of his office. When he arrived an hour later, we spread the blueprints across the same workbench where my father had rebuilt pump motors years earlier. He adjusted his glasses, studied every signature, and quietly smiled. He did not celebrate. He simply tapped the original easement map with one finger and said, "Ethan, these records do not just prove ownership. They explain why the neighborhood loses water whenever this private system is legitimately taken offline for maintenance." At that moment, the pieces finally fit together. Rebecca believed she controlled the story because she controlled the loudest voice. She had completely forgotten that engineering records, county filings, and recorded easements never cared who spoke the loudest. They only cared about what had actually been built. My attorney told me that the strongest case is often the quietest one because facts become impossible to ignore when they are allowed to speak for themselves. Instead of sending another angry letter or arguing with the Homeowners Association board, we decided to follow every rule exactly as it had been written. We organized every blueprint, every easement agreement, every inspection report, and every maintenance record into chronological order. The original county filings were copied, certified, and placed into separate binders. We requested updated property surveys from a licensed county surveyor, hired an independent hydrologist to confirm the operating layout of the water system, and scheduled a routine maintenance shutdown that had already been recommended during the previous annual inspection. Nothing about the work was unusual. The main pressure valve required replacement, several electrical relays needed testing, and the storage tank sensors were due for calibration. Under both county regulations and the recorded easement agreements, temporary interruptions for maintenance were completely authorized as long as reasonable notice was provided. So that is exactly what I did. 72 hours before the scheduled work, I mailed certified notices to every address listed in the original service agreements. Additional copies were delivered to the county utility office, the sheriff's department, the emergency management coordinator, and the Homeowners Association office. I even posted bright yellow maintenance notices near every legal access point connected to the system. The language was simple, professional, and impossible to misunderstand. Routine maintenance would begin at 6:12 on Tuesday morning. Water service supplied through the private ranch system could experience temporary interruptions during scheduled repairs. Contact information was included for questions. I kept copies of every receipt, every tracking number, and every signed delivery confirmation inside a single folder. My attorney smiled when he saw how carefully everything had been documented. He said preparation like this often determined the outcome long before anyone entered a courtroom. Meanwhile, Rebecca behaved as though none of it mattered. At the next Homeowners Association meeting, she dismissed the notices as unnecessary scare tactics and assured homeowners that neighborhood water service could not legally be interrupted because, according to her, essential infrastructure belonged to the community. Several residents asked whether they should prepare for temporary outages anyway. She laughed and confidently told everyone to ignore the letters because the ranch owner had no authority to affect neighborhood utilities. Those words spread through Willow Creek Estates faster than my official notices ever could. Neighbors watered their lawns, scheduled appliance deliveries, and planned backyard gatherings as though Tuesday would be completely ordinary. I did not argue with any of them. I simply continued preparing the equipment exactly the way my father had taught me years earlier. The replacement valve arrived on Friday. I inspected every gasket, cleaned every fitting, and laid every tool neatly across the workbench inside the pump house. The familiar smell of fresh lubricant and polished steel filled the room, while the old blueprints rested safely inside protective sleeves on the nearby shelf. Early Monday evening, I walked one final inspection along the pipeline route beneath a sky glowing orange above the rolling pasture. The windmill turned slowly against the fading light, and for the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. I was not setting a trap for anyone. I was simply maintaining equipment that legally belonged to my family, following procedures that had existed for decades. If someone chose to ignore every notice, every document, and every recorded agreement, the truth waiting beneath this ranch would reveal itself without me needing to raise my voice at all. Tuesday arrived with the kind of quiet sunrise that usually promised an uneventful day. At exactly 6:12 in the morning, I unlocked the pump house, reviewed the maintenance checklist one final time, and slowly closed the primary valve before disconnecting power to the main pump assembly. The familiar mechanical hum faded into silence, leaving only the distant sound of cattle moving across the pasture and the steady breeze brushing through the oak trees. My contractor began removing the old valve while I documented every step with time-stamped photographs and inspection notes. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone lit up with messages faster than I could read them. Homeowners reported dry kitchen faucets, silent sprinklers, and empty shower lines. Then came the calls from numbers I recognized. First, the county utility office asking whether scheduled maintenance had begun exactly as listed in my notice. Then the emergency management coordinator confirming that all required notifications had been received. I answered every question calmly because every answer matched the paperwork already sitting inside my binder. The first sheriff's deputy arrived shortly afterward, followed by a county utility inspector whose truck carried the same official seal that had appeared on decades of inspection reports inside my cabinet. Before either of them could speak, another sport utility vehicle raced through the ranch entrance. Rebecca stepped out looking completely certain that the morning would end in her favor. She pointed toward the silent pump house and loudly declared that I had intentionally shut down the neighborhood water supply without authorization. She insisted that essential community infrastructure had been sabotaged and demanded immediate enforcement. The deputy listened patiently before turning toward me and asking a single question. "Did you provide advance notice?" I handed him a folder containing certified mail receipts, delivery confirmations, maintenance schedules, engineering recommendations, and copies of every notification sent 72 hours earlier. He flipped through the documents slowly while the county utility inspector examined the original work order posted beside the pump house door. Rebecca interrupted several times, insisting that the Homeowners Association controlled the facility regardless of whatever papers I happened to carry. The inspector looked at her politely and asked a question that changed the entire morning. "Can you provide the recorded ownership documents transferring this infrastructure to the Homeowners Association?" The confident expression on her face paused for the first time since I had known her. She answered by saying everyone understood the neighborhood owned the system because it had supplied water for years. The inspector shook his head gently. "Usage is not ownership." He then unfolded the certified survey my attorney had provided the previous afternoon and matched it against the county geographic records on his tablet. Every pipeline, every easement, every property boundary aligned perfectly with the original engineering drawings created decades earlier. Another county engineer arrived after reviewing archived utility records from the courthouse. Within minutes, they confirmed that the pump house, storage facilities, transmission line, and operating equipment remained privately owned by the Callaway Ranch exactly as originally recorded. Even more important, they confirmed that no replacement municipal supply had ever been completed for Willow Creek Estates. The temporary connection established decades earlier had simply continued without anyone formally changing the legal agreements. Rebecca stood completely silent as the county officials quietly discussed how such a misunderstanding had survived for so many years. No one raised their voice. No dramatic argument unfolded. The truth emerged one document at a time, just as my attorney had predicted, and by the time the replacement valve was ready for installation, the loudest claim in the valley had been reduced to nothing more than an assumption that official records could no longer support. By early afternoon, the new valve had been installed, every pressure test had passed, and I wrapped my hand around the same steel handle that had started the longest morning of my life. As the pump motor came back to life, its steady mechanical rhythm echoed through the old building exactly the way it had when I was a child standing beside my father. Water surged through the transmission line. Pressure climbed across the gauges one number at a time, and within minutes the county utility inspector confirmed that service had been fully restored throughout Willow Creek Estates. The silence that followed felt completely different from the one that had settled over the ranch at sunrise. This time it was the silence that comes when arguments finally run out of room and facts are left standing alone. Over the following weeks, the county completed a formal review of the original easement records, engineering files, and development agreements. Their findings matched every document my family had preserved for decades. The ranch owned the pump house, the storage facilities, the primary transmission line, and every operating component connected to them. The neighborhood had continued receiving water through temporary agreements that had never been replaced by the independent system originally planned by the first developer. County officials instructed the Homeowners Association to stop representing the infrastructure as community property and to begin negotiating a lawful long-term service agreement instead of relying on assumptions that had never existed on paper. Several homeowners later visited the ranch, not to argue, but to apologize. Many admitted they had honestly believed their monthly association dues covered ownership of the water system because that was the only version of the story they had ever heard. I invited them into the pump house, showed them the old blueprints, the maintenance logs, and the original photographs of my grandfather pouring the concrete foundation with his own hands. Watching those expressions change reminded me that most people are willing to accept the truth once they are finally allowed to see it. Rebecca resigned from the Homeowners Association board before the next annual election. I never celebrated her departure because that was never the victory I wanted. Positions can be replaced, names on office doors eventually change, and neighborhood politics always move on to the next disagreement. What mattered was that the records had been corrected, the property boundaries had been respected again, and future homeowners would inherit facts instead of rumors. A few months later, a new agreement was signed. The neighborhood would continue receiving water through the ranch under clear legal terms, transparent maintenance schedules, and properly documented responsibilities reviewed by the county. Every party understood exactly who owned what, exactly who maintained what, and exactly how temporary shutdowns would be handled in the future. There would be no more guessing and no more imagined authority. Sometimes I still stand outside the pump house before sunrise with a cup of coffee, listening to the familiar hum of the machinery and watching the first lights spread across the pasture. The old blueprints now rest inside climate-controlled storage instead of a dusty cabinet, but I keep one framed copy on the workshop wall as a reminder that the strongest foundation is never concrete or steel. It is truth that has been carefully preserved. People often believe justice arrives with loud speeches or dramatic moments. My grandfather understood something much simpler. Justice moves quietly, just like water. It follows the path that already exists, and sooner or later it always finds its way back to the source.